The flickering flames of the hearth danced in the small cottage, casting long shadows on the stone walls. Elara sat in the corner, her hands trembling slightly as she wrapped a fresh bandage around an elderly villager's wound. Her mind was elsewhere, lost in the bitter words that had been spoken just hours before. "You're wasting your life, Elara." Leoric's voice echoed in her thoughts, as cold and cutting as the autumn wind that rattled the windows. She tightened the bandage, though not enough to cause discomfort, and offered a soft smile to the old man. "There, that should help," she said, her voice calm and steady, despite the storm brewing inside her. "Thank you, child," the man wheezed, his eyes full of gratitude. "We're lucky to have you." Elara helped him to his feet, her heart heavy with a weight she hadn't spoken aloud. As she guided him to the door, her mind returned to Leoric's sharp tongue, to the way he'd belittled her work, her purpose, before the eyes of the kingdom's elite. He hadn't even looked at her when he said it, his attention focused more on the golden goblet in his hand than on the woman who had once thought herself in love with him. A nurse? He'd scoffed to his wealthy friends, seated around the grand dining table. "It's hardly a noble calling. A servant's job, tending to the sick and poor." The room had erupted in laughter, the sound of it still ringing in Elara's ears. She hadn't defended herself. She hadn't spoken up. Instead, she'd excused herself, her cheeks burning with shame, and fled the hall. Now, in the quiet of her cottage, the humiliation still stung. How could he not see the value in her work? The lives she had saved? The comfort she had brought to so many in their darkest moments? She closed the door behind the villager, leaning her forehead against the rough wood for a long moment. The warmth of the fire barely touched her, and her thoughts spun in circles. She had spent years as a healer, believing in the goodness of her craft, and yet in the eyes of the man she loved, it had been worth nothing. A sharp knock at the door startled her from her reverie. Straightening herself, she opened it to find a young boy, wide-eyed and breathless. "Elara! The adventurers, they're here!" he exclaimed. "They're looking for people to join them. They say there's treasure deep in the forest." Elara's brow furrowed. She had heard the rumors of a group of adventurers arriving in the capital, talking of old ruins and ancient relics buried in the forest of whispering shadows. But she hadn't given it much thought. Her life was here, with the people who needed her. Still, a part of her, buried beneath the layers of routine and responsibility, stirred at the idea. Adventure. Freedom. Something beyond the confines of her small world. "Thank you, Eamon," she said, her voice thoughtful. "I'll think on it." The boy nodded and dashed off, no doubt eager to spread the news to the rest of the village. Elara closed the door again, her heart racing. She sat down by the fire, staring into the flames. Was this her chance? The opportunity to leave behind the life she had built here, to escape the shadow of Leoric's cruelty, and find her own path? The thought was enticing, but there were doubts too. Could she really abandon her village? The people who depended on her? And what of the dangers that awaited in the forest? She had heard the tales, of beasts and traps, of men who entered the ruins and never returned. But as the night deepened, so did her resolve. Elara had spent too long being defined by others, by Leoric, by the villagers, even by the role she had taken on as a healer. Perhaps it was time to define herself. The morning came quickly, and with it, a crisp chill that carried the scent of autumn leaves and damp earth. Elara packed her small satchel with care, taking only the essentials, her herbs, bandages, and a single keepsake from her mother, a silver locket she had worn as a child. As she stepped outside, the village was still, the mist clinging to the thatched roofs and muddy paths. Her heart pounded as she made her way to the town square, where the adventurers were gathering. A crowd had already formed, villagers murmuring in excitement as they watched the group of strangers prepare for their journey. Elara spotted them immediately: Rowan, the archer, his bow slung over his back; Marek, the warrior, standing tall with a massive sword strapped to his side; Talia, the sorceress, whose eyes seemed to glow with an otherworldly light; and Kalin, the rogue, who moved with the grace of a shadow. They were an intimidating sight, but something about them drew Elara in. This was no longer just a rumor. This was real, and she had a choice to make. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward. "I'd like to join you," she said, her voice steady, though her heart raced. Rowan turned to her, his sharp blue eyes scanning her from head to toe. "A healer?" he asked, his tone neutral. "Yes," Alara replied, standing tall. "I can keep your wounds from festering. I can save lives." Talia stepped forward, her gaze piercing. "The forest is dangerous," she said softly. "More dangerous than you know. Are you prepared for what you might face?" Alara hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "I am." Marek grinned, his broad face breaking into a smile. "We could use someone like you," he said, clapping Rowan on the shoulder. "What do you think?" Rowan shrugged, his expression unreadable. "If she can keep us alive, she's in." And just like that, Alara found herself among them, a healer turned adventurer, stepping into a world far different from the one she had known. As they set off toward the dark horizon of the Whispering Shadows, Alara couldn't help but glance back at the village one last time. The life she was leaving behind felt distant already, as if it belonged to someone else. Ahead of her, the path was uncertain, fraught with danger, betrayal, and the unknown. But for the first time in her life, Alara wasn't afraid. She was ready. The sun hung low in the sky, casting an orange glow across the landscape as the group of adventurers made their way toward the looming tree-line of the Forest of Whispering Shadows. The road beneath their feet was rough, lined with twisted roots and stones worn smooth by years of travel. But as they drew closer to the forest, the air itself seemed to change. It grew thick, cool, and heavy with a sense of foreboding. The Whispering Shadows lived up to its name, as the wind rustled through the trees, creating a sound that almost seemed like murmured voices. Alara kept pace with the group, her heart pounding, but she tried to calm herself with every step. The villagers had told stories about the forest for as long as she could remember. Tales of ancient creatures lurking in the shadows, of travelers who ventured too deep and were never seen again. But standing here, at the edge of the woods, the fear was no longer something distant, it was real. Rowan, the archer, moved with confidence at the head of the group, his sharp eyes scanning the path ahead. Marek, the warrior, followed close behind, his massive sword slung across his back as if it were nothing more than a piece of cloth. Talia, the sorceress, walked with quiet grace, her fingers brushing the air as if sensing the magic in the land around them. And then there was Kalen, the rogue, who stayed at the rear, his eyes constantly darting around, watching everything with a calculating gleam. As they passed under the first towering trees of the forest, the light dimmed, swallowed by the thick canopy overhead. The temperature dropped, and Alara instinctively pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders. It was a different world here, silent, apart from the occasional crack of a twig or the distant call of some unseen bird. The deeper they ventured, the more the outside world seemed to fade away, replaced by the oppressive weight of the forest's ancient presence. "How far is it to the ruins?" Alara asked, her voice low, not wanting to disturb the eerie quiet. "About a day's journey," Rowan replied without turning. "We'll camp tonight and reach it by midday tomorrow." Alara nodded, though her stomach twisted at the thought of spending a night in these woods. She wasn't sure if it was her imagination, but the shadows around them seemed to move, as if the trees themselves were watching, waiting for something. Talia must have sensed her unease, for the sorceress glanced back at her with a faint smile. "The forest plays tricks on those who aren't used to it. Don't let it get to you." "Is it magical?" Alara asked. "In a way," Talia replied, her eyes gleaming in the dim light. "Old magic. The kind that lingers in places long forgotten by men." They walked in silence for several more hours, the forest growing darker as the sun disappeared behind the horizon. Finally, Rowan raised a hand, signaling them to stop. "We'll make camp here," he said, gesturing to a small clearing off the side of the path. "Get some rest. We'll need it." Marek immediately set to work gathering wood for a fire, while Kalen busied himself setting up a makeshift perimeter around the camp, stringing up thin wires and small bells. Alara watched him curiously, her healer's hands itching to help, but she wasn't sure where to start. Traps, Kaylin said, not looking at her. In case something, or someone, decides to pay us a visit tonight. Elara's pulse quickened. Do you think we're being followed? Kaylin smirked, though it didn't reach his eyes. Always a possibility in places like this. Elara shivered, more from his words than from the chill in the air. She busied herself with preparing her small pack of herbs and bandages, readying them in case anyone was hurt. It gave her hands something to do, a way to steady her nerves. The fire crackled to life as Marek struck flint against steel, and soon the group huddled around its warmth. The light flickered across their faces, casting shadows that made them seem older, wearier than they were. So, Marek said, breaking the silence as he bit into a piece of dried meat. What brings a healer like you to a place like this, Elara? Elara paused, her gaze flickering to the fire. She wasn't sure how much of her story she wanted to share, but something about the camaraderie of the moment made her feel safe enough to speak. I needed a change, she said softly. I spent too long in one place, trying to live up to expectations that weren't my own. I wanted to see what else the world had to offer. Rowan glanced up from sharpening his arrows, his eyes narrowing slightly. Expectations? Elara hesitated, but then the words tumbled out before she could stop them. My former life wasn't what I thought it would be. I was with someone who didn't see the value in what I did. She stopped herself, not wanting to get lost in the hurt of those memories. He made me feel like I wasn't enough. There was a brief silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Elara stared into the flames, feeling the weight of the past pressing down on her, but when she glanced up, she was met with understanding looks from her companions. Marek grunted. People like that aren't worth your time, he said bluntly, his voice thick with the deep rumble of certainty. You're out here now, doing something real. Elara smiled faintly. Thank you. Talia leaned back, her gaze drifting to the dark forests beyond their camp. The world has a way of showing us who we really are, once we step away from the things that hold us back. Elara looked at her, sensing the wisdom behind the sorceress's words. Perhaps that was what this journey was for, finding out who she truly was, beyond the labels and expectations others had placed on her. As the conversation died down, one by one, they drifted off to sleep. Elara lay close to the fire, her cloak wrapped tightly around her, her mind still buzzing with the thoughts of the day. She listened to the sounds of the forest, the distant rustling of leaves, the hoot of an owl, and tried to still her racing heart. But just as her eyes began to close, a soft sound reached her ears, so faint she almost didn't notice it. A whisper. Her eyes flew open, scanning the shadows beyond the firelight. For a moment, everything seemed still, but then she heard it again, soft, like the wind through the trees, but there was something else to it. Words. Elara. Her breath caught in her throat. She sat up slowly, her heart pounding in her chest, staring into the thick darkness. Had she imagined it? Or was something out there, watching them from the shadows? She glanced around at her companions, all asleep and unaware of the soft, haunting whisper that called her name. Elara. The voice was closer now. She wasn't imagining it. Something was calling to her, pulling her toward the darkness of the forest. She stood slowly, her legs trembling beneath her. She knew she shouldn't leave the safety of the fire, but the whisper was relentless, beckoning her forward, into the unknown. With one last glance at the sleeping adventurers, Elara took a step into the shadows. Elara's feet moved almost of their own accord as she stepped beyond the glow of the firelight, into the thick, looming shadows of the forest. The air here felt different, heavier, colder, and alive with the soft whisper that continued to call her name. Elara. The voice was faint, ethereal, like the wind passing through the trees, but it tugged at something deep within her. Each step she took felt surreal, as if the world around her was slowing down, and yet her pulse quickened in her ears. She glanced back toward the camp, her companions still fast asleep, their forms outlined by the dim, flickering fire. Her heart pounded, a war of instinct and curiosity raging inside her. Don't go. The sensible voice in her mind urged her to stop, to turn around and wake the others, but the pull of the whisper was too strong. It wasn't threatening, but rather familiar. Almost comforting, in a strange way. She moved deeper into the forest, her hands brushing against rough bark as she weaved between trees that stood like silent sentinels. The mist thickened around her, swirling at her feet, and the canopy above seemed to close in, blocking out the moonlight. The darkness here was thick, but she could just make out faint outlines, the twisted shapes of roots, the gnarled branches above, and the moss-covered stones that littered the ground. Elara! The whisper was closer now, more insistent. It sounded almost like her mother. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Impossible. Her mother had died years ago, when Elara was just a girl. It had been a fever, quick, merciless, and unstoppable, despite every healing herb and tincture Elara's young hands had tried. She remembered holding her mother's hand as she passed, the warmth of life slipping away, leaving only the cold silence of grief behind. But now that voice, so familiar, so tender, called to her again. Elara, come! Her heart wrenched with both fear and longing. She knew it couldn't be real. It was the forest, playing tricks on her mind. Talia had warned her, this place was filled with old magic, magic that could twist reality, blur the line between what was real and imagined. But still, the pull was undeniable. Her hand instinctively reached up to touch the silver locket around her neck, the one her mother had given her before she passed. She hadn't opened it in years, not since the pain of that loss had begun to fade into a dull ache. But now, standing alone in the heart of this enchanted forest, she felt that ache return with full force. Elara! The voice was almost pleading now, and it stirred something deep inside her. She took another step forward, her hand tightening around the locket, and then another. The forest seemed to shift around her, the mist parting as if guiding her towards something unseen. And then she saw it, a faint, glowing light in the distance. It shimmered through the trees, soft and pale, like the first light of dawn breaking through the dark. Her breath quickened as she moved toward it, her eyes fixed on the glow. The whisper grew louder, though the words were still indistinct, carried on the wind like fragments of a dream. As Elara neared the source of the light, the trees thinned, and she found herself standing at the edge of a small clearing. In the center of the clearing stood an ancient stone structure, half buried in the earth, its surface covered in thick moss and creeping vines. The light emanated from the structure, pulsing gently, as if beckoning her closer. She stepped forward cautiously, her heart racing, every nerve on edge. There was something about this place, something old, powerful, and deeply unsettling. Yet, at the same time, it felt welcoming. Her eyes were drawn to the base of the structure, where a narrow archway led into darkness. The whisper was louder now, almost deafening, though it still carried the soft tone of her mother's voice. Elara, come inside. Her feet moved toward the archway, though her mind screamed at her to stop. This is wrong. She knew it deep down. The forest was playing tricks on her, twisting her memories, her emotions. This wasn't her mother's voice, it couldn't be. But as she reached the archway, her hand brushing the cold stone, something inside the darkness shifted. A soft gust of wind blew from within, carrying with it the scent of wildflowers, her mother's favorite scent. Tears welled in Elara's eyes. She felt torn, standing on the edge of a choice that could change everything. What if it really was her mother? What if the forest held some ancient magic that could reunite them, if only for a moment? Elara! The voice was so close now, as if just beyond the archway. With a trembling hand, Elara took a step forward, her body half inside the darkened passage. But then... Elara! A sharp voice pierced the air, shattering the spell that had gripped her. She spun around, her heart hammering in her chest, to see Rowan standing at the edge of the clearing, his bow drawn, an arrow nocked and aimed at the stone structure. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his eyes wide with alarm. Elara blinked, the haze of the whisper beginning to lift. She stepped back from the archway, her mind suddenly clear. What had she been thinking? She had almost walked straight into the heart of the forest's magic, lured by the false promise of her mother's voice. I don't know, she stammered, stepping further away from the archway. I thought I heard. Rowan lowered his bow but didn't relax. His eyes were sharp, scanning the structure with a mix of suspicion and fear. This place is dangerous, he said, his voice tight. You shouldn't have wandered off. Alara nodded, still shaken by how easily she had been drawn in. It sounded like my mother, she whispered, more to herself than to Rowan. It was so real. Rowan's gaze softened, but only slightly. The forest preys on your mind, he said. It knows what you want most and uses it against you. Whatever you heard, it wasn't real. Alara looked back at the glowing structure, the soft light still pulsing from within. She shuddered at the thought of what might have happened if Rowan hadn't found her in time. Come on, Rowan said, stepping closer to her. We need to get back to camp before anyone else wakes up. With one last glance at the ancient structure, Alara followed him back through the trees, the whispering voice now gone, replaced by the cold silence of the forest. But even as they returned to the warmth of the campfire, Alara couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The forest had seen into her heart, pulled her deepest sorrow to the surface, and nearly consumed her with it. She couldn't help but wonder what else it would show her before their journey was through, and whether she would be strong enough to resist it. As she lay down beside the fire once more, sleep eluding her, Alara's hand drifted to the locket around her neck. The memory of her mother was still there, but the voice that had called to her in the dark was not. And somehow, she knew that this was only the beginning of the forest's tricks. Alara's sleep was restless, filled with fragmented dreams of voices calling her name, of mist-shrouded figures just out of reach. The forest seemed to wrap itself around her even in her slumber, whispering ancient words she couldn't quite understand. When she finally awoke, the fire had burned low, casting only faint embers into the early morning air. The forest was still, silent, as if waiting for them to make their next move. She sat up, rubbing the sleep from her eyes, and glanced around the camp. The others were already stirring. Rowan was crouched by the fire, sharpening his arrows, his gaze occasionally flicking toward the trees as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows at any moment. Marek stood by, packing up his gear, while Talia murmured softly to herself, her hands tracing intricate symbols in the air, likely preparing wards for the journey ahead. Kalen, the rogue, was nowhere to be seen, though Alara had a feeling he was nearby, watching, as he always did. The events of the previous night lingered in her mind like a fog that refused to lift. She could still feel the pull of the ancient stone structure, the way it had called to her with a voice that wasn't quite her mother's but had felt so real. A chill ran down her spine at the thought of how close she had come to stepping into that darkness. Alara! Rowan's voice broke through her thoughts. He was watching her, his expression unreadable. You all right? She nodded slowly, though the unease in her chest hadn't fully faded. I think so. I still don't understand what happened last night. Rowan's gaze softened slightly. The forest is full of tricks, especially this one. It's designed to prey on your fears and your desires. You need to keep your wits about you out here. Alara bit her lip, her fingers absent-mindedly brushing the silver locket at her throat. It felt so real, she whispered, more to herself than to Rowan. Like my mother was calling me. Rowan gave her a long look but said nothing. Instead, he stood and stretched, slinging his bow across his back. We need to move, he said. The ruins are close, and the sooner we get there, the better. Alara nodded, pushing herself to her feet. She glanced toward the spot where the ancient structure had stood the night before, now hidden behind the thick trees and mist. A part of her wanted to go back, to see it in the light of day, but the wiser part of her knew that whatever had called to her from within was better left untouched. The group packed up quickly, and within minutes, they were on the move again, heading deeper into the forest. The air was still damp with morning dew, and the trees towered above them, their branches like twisted arms reaching for the sky. The path was narrow and uneven, forcing them to walk in single file, with Rowan leading and Kalen reappearing at the rear, as silent as ever. As they walked, Elara couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig sent her heart racing. The forest seemed alive in a way that no natural place should be. There was a presence here, something ancient and unseen, lurking just beyond the edges of their awareness. Marek, walking just ahead of her, glanced back. "You feel it too?" he asked, his voice low. Elara nodded. "It's like the forest is watching us." Marek grunted in agreement. "This place has always had a reputation. Old magic. My guess is it doesn't like us poking around where we don't belong." Talia, who had been walking silently at the front, suddenly slowed her pace and held up a hand. "Wait." The group stopped, tense and alert. Elara's heart quickened as she scanned the forest around them, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. No movement, no sound. Just the thick mist and the oppressive weight of the ancient trees. "What is it?" Rowan asked, his voice quiet but firm. Talia's eyes narrowed, her fingers tracing the air as if feeling for something unseen. "There's something close," she murmured. "I can feel the magic. It's faint, but it's old. Very old." The group exchanged uneasy glances. "Is it dangerous?" Marek asked, his hand moving instinctively to the hilt of his sword. Talia didn't answer right away. She closed her eyes for a moment, her face tightening in concentration. Then she opened them and shook her head. "Not yet. But we should be careful." Rowan nodded and motioned for them to continue, but the tension in the air was palpable now, as if the forest itself had drawn closer, watching their every move. They walked for another hour, the trees growing denser, the mist thicker. The path beneath their feet became more treacherous, and several times, Elara had to catch herself as her boots slipped on the moss-covered stones. But then, as the sun began to climb higher into the sky, the forest suddenly parted, revealing the ruins. The sight stopped them all in their tracks. The ancient structure loomed before them, half buried in the earth, just as Elara had seen in the visions the night before. Towering stone pillars jutted from the ground at odd angles, their surfaces cracked and worn by centuries of weather and time. Vines and moss clung to every surface, and the once grand entrance was now little more than a dark, gaping hole that led into the earth. The air here was different, heavier, saturated with the weight of forgotten ages. Elara could feel the magic thrumming beneath her feet, a quiet hum that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the land itself. "So this is it," Marek said, his voice low and full of awe. "The ruins." Rowan stepped forward, his eyes scanning the structure. "Stay alert. We don't know what's inside, or who's been here before us." The group cautiously approached the entrance. As they drew closer, Elara's breath caught in her throat. There, carved into the stone above the entrance, were symbols, ancient runes that she didn't recognize. But there was something unsettling about them, as if they were watching, waiting for something. Talia moved to the front, her hands hovering near the runes. She muttered softly under her breath, her fingers tracing the air as if reading an invisible map. "These runes are a ward," she said after a moment. "A powerful one. Whoever built this place didn't want anyone getting in, or out." Elara's stomach twisted. "What does it mean?" "It means we need to be very careful," Talia replied, her eyes narrowing. "This place was sealed for a reason. And whatever's inside, may not want to be disturbed." Kalen, who had been uncharacteristically silent, spoke up from the back. "So what's the plan?" "Walk in and hope for the best." Rowan shot him a look. "We came here to find the relic," he said. "We stick to the plan. Get in, find it, and get out." The group exchanged wary glances, but no one argued. The relic was why they had come. It was the key to everything, the key to power, to wealth, to answers. But standing here, at the mouth of the ruins, Elara couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. With a deep breath, Rowan stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "Let's go." One by one, they followed him into the darkness. As they crossed the threshold, the air seemed to change again, colder, thicker, and heavy with the scent of damp stone and something else, something old and rotting. The figure that emerged from the shadows was unmistakable. Kalen, the rogue who had always lingered at the edges of their group, watching with sharp eyes and an ever-present smirk, now stood before them. But something was wrong. His usual sly grin was gone, replaced by an eerie calmness that chilled Alara to her core. "How did you?" Rowan began, his voice full of suspicion, as he slowly drew his sword from its sheath. "We just saw you," Marek added, eyes narrowing, his hand on the hilt of his weapon. Alara's heart pounded in her chest, confusion swirling in her mind. She had just seen Kalen at the rear of the group moments ago. How could he have gotten ahead of them so quickly? And why was there something so different about him now? Kalen's gaze swept over them all, his eyes colder than Alara had ever seen. He wasn't the rogue she had known. There was something in his posture, in the way he held himself, that was utterly foreign. His expression, usually mischievous and calculating, was now blank, emotionless. A deep unease settled over the group. "I've been here longer than you realize," Kalen said quietly, his voice echoing in the chamber. "Watching. Waiting." Rowan stepped forward, his sword gleaming in the dim light. "What are you talking about, Kalen? If you've been working with someone else, now's the time to speak up." Kalen's lips twitched into a faint smile, but it was devoid of any warmth. "You've been so focused on the relic, so consumed by what you came here for, that you never stopped to ask the right questions. Did you ever wonder why we found this place so easily? Why the forest seemed to lead us straight here?" Ilara's stomach tightened with dread. How could we have been so blind? "What do you mean?" Talia demanded, stepping up beside Rowan, her voice edged with anger. "You were the one who suggested this path. You were the one who claimed to know where the ruins were. And you followed," Kalen said simply, his tone chillingly calm. "All of you followed without question, because you wanted what the relic could offer. Power, wealth, knowledge. It's why we're all here, isn't it? To take something that doesn't belong to us." Alara felt a cold knot of fear settle in her chest. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly falling into place. Kalen had always seemed one step ahead, too informed, too willing to push them in certain directions. She had dismissed it as part of his roguish charm, but now it all felt like manipulation. She had never imagined betrayal would come from within their own group. "You led us here," Rowan said through clenched teeth, his grip tightening on his sword. "Why?" Kalen tilted his head slightly, the faint smile never leaving his face. "Because this place requires a sacrifice. It always has. And you, my dear companions, are the perfect offering." A shocked silence fell over the group, the weight of his words sinking in like a stone. Alara's breath caught in her throat. "A sacrifice? What have you done?" Marek growled, stepping forward, his sword drawn. "I've done nothing," Kalen replied smoothly, taking a step back toward the shadows. "The ruins have a life of their own. They were sealed for a reason. And now, thanks to you, they will awaken again." Alara's mind raced. The forest, the ruins, the strange pull she had felt the night before, it was all connected. They hadn't just stumbled upon these ruins by chance. Kalen had been leading them here, guiding them straight into the heart of an ancient trap. Talia stepped forward, her face pale but her voice steady. "You think the ruins will spare you, Kalen? Whatever force you've aligned yourself with, it will turn on you, just as it plans to do with us." Kalen's smile faltered for a brief moment, but then he shrugged. "Perhaps. But I've made my choices. And so have all of you. You came here for something, just like I did. Only now, you won't be the ones to leave." Rowan lunged forward with a snarl, but Kalen was quick, darting back into the shadows with a fluid grace that only a rogue could manage. Rowan's sword clanged against the stone, but Kalen was already gone, disappearing into the darkness as if he had never been there. For a moment, the group stood in stunned silence, the reality of the betrayal sinking in. "We need to leave," Alara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now. Before whatever Kalen set in motion happens." But as soon as she spoke, the chamber around them began to tremble. The ancient walls groaned under the weight of time and magic, and a deep, rumbling sound echoed from somewhere far below. Dust and small stones fell from the ceiling, and the very air seemed to thrum with a dark energy. Talia's eyes widened in alarm as she stepped back, her fingers flying in quick gestures, casting protection wards. "It's too late," she said, her voice filled with dread. "Something's waking up." Rowan cursed under his breath. "We can't stay here. We need to get back outside." The group turned, ready to flee the chamber, but as they reached the entrance, a thick, impenetrable darkness rose up like a wall, blocking their way. The air grew colder, and the shadows in the room seemed to shift and move on their own, as if alive. "We're trapped," Marek muttered, his eyes wide. Talia's magic flared at the edge of the darkness, but it flickered and died against the overwhelming power that filled the ruins. She shook her head. "This is ancient magic, stronger than anything I've encountered." Elara's heart pounded in her chest. The whispers were back, louder this time, swirling around them, echoing off the stone walls. But they weren't calling her name anymore. They were speaking in a language she couldn't understand, a deep, guttural chant that sent chills down her spine. Rowan's grip on his sword tightened as he turned to face the center of the chamber. "Then we fight," he said grimly, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "Whatever comes, we face it together." Elara's fingers trembled as she reached for her staff, her heart racing as the whispers grew louder. Whatever force had been sleeping here was waking up, and Kaelin had been the one to unleash it. But as they prepared for battle, Elara couldn't help but wonder if there was more to Kaelin's betrayal than they realized. The ruins had been sealed for a reason. And now, they were about to find out why. The chamber trembled more violently as the dark presence within the ruins stirred. The shadows swirled around them, thickening into almost solid shapes, their whispers growing into a cacophony of voices that filled the room. Elara could feel the oppressive weight of magic pressing down on her, like the very air was turning against them. Rowan stood at the ready, his sword gleaming in the dim light. Talia's hands moved swiftly, her magic pulsing faintly against the overwhelming darkness. Marek's muscles tensed, his sword gripped tightly as his eyes darted to every corner of the room. Elara's heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to focus. "We need to get to the center," Talia shouted over the growing roar of the ruins. "The source of the magic, it's coming from below. If we can break it." A guttural scream echoed through the chamber, cutting off her words. The shadows near the far wall twisted and distorted, taking on a humanoid form, tall, robed in black mist, with glowing red eyes that burned with malice. It was no longer just a presence. It had manifested. The dark figure raised a hand, and the air itself seemed to freeze. Elara gasped as an icy cold spread through the chamber, numbing her fingers and making it hard to breathe. "It's the guardian of the ruins," Talia whispered, her voice trembling. "The one meant to protect the relic." Rowan stepped forward, his jaw clenched in determination. "Then we destroy it." With a battle cry, he charged toward the figure, his sword flashing in the dim light. But as he struck, his blade met only air. The figure dissolved into shadows, reforming behind him in an instant. With a flick of its hand, Rowan was thrown backward, crashing into the stone wall with a thud. "Elara!" Talia called, her voice filled with urgency. "I need you!" Elara rushed to her side, her staff shaking in her grip. "What do we do?" "The runes!" Talia pointed to the ancient symbols carved into the walls. "They're binding it. If we can disrupt the magic holding them together, we might be able to weaken the Guardian." Elara's mind raced. The runes, they were the key. She had felt the power of the runes when they first entered the ruins, but now it made sense. They were feeding the dark magic that held the Guardian in place. "We'll hold it off!" Marek shouted, stepping forward with his sword raised. His eyes met Talia's, a silent promise passing between them. Rowan, bruised but unbroken, picked himself up and stood beside him. Talia began chanting, her voice low and melodic, weaving a spell of disruption. Elara closed her eyes, focusing on the ancient runes that pulsed with dark energy. She could feel the magic within them, old and tangled, but she could also feel where it was weakest. "Elara, hurry!" Marek yelled as he swung his sword at the Guardian, his strikes barely keeping the dark figure at bay. Rowan's arrows flew through the air, but they, too, passed through the shadows as though the Guardian were made of mist. Elara's heart pounded as she placed her hands on the stone wall. She whispered an incantation, her voice trembling but determined. The runes beneath her fingertips glowed faintly, resisting her magic, but she pushed harder, channeling all the power she had learned as a healer and a mage. This wasn't just about strength, it was about precision, about unraveling the spell piece by piece. Suddenly, a crack appeared in the stone. The runes flickered and dimmed, their glow fading. Elara felt the shift in the air. The Guardian's power was weakening. But the Guardian wasn't done. With a terrible screech, it raised both arms, and a surge of dark energy shot toward them. Elara cried out as the force hit her, knocking her to the ground. Pain shot through her body, but she gritted her teeth, forcing herself to stand. "We can't hold it much longer!" Marek shouted, his voice strained as he blocked another blow from the Guardian. "Just a little more," Talia said, her face pale with concentration. "Elara, you're almost there!" Elara pressed her hands against the stone again, her entire body trembling with effort. She could feel the runes breaking apart under her magic, the spell unraveling like a frayed rope. With one final push, she sent a surge of energy through the runes. The wall cracked. A blinding light burst from the stone, and the runes shattered, their magic dissipating into the air like dust on the wind. The Guardian let out a howl of rage as its form flickered, weakened by the loss of its power source. Marek seized the moment, lunging forward with a roar. His sword cut through the figure's mist-like body, and this time, the Guardian didn't reform. With a final, echoing scream, the dark figure dissolved into nothingness, its presence vanishing from the chamber. Silence fell, the oppressive weight of the ruins lifting as the dark magic faded. The air was still and cold, but it no longer felt suffocating. Elara collapsed to her knees, breathing hard, her body aching from the effort of breaking the runes. "We did it," Talia whispered, her voice filled with relief. Rowan helped Elara to her feet, his face bruised but smiling. "That was close," he said, his voice shaky with exhaustion. Marek sheathed his sword, his face grim. "We need to get out of here. Before anything else wakes up." The group moved quickly, their steps hurried as they retraced their path through the ruins. The darkness no longer pursued them, and the eerie whispers had vanished. But Elara's mind was still spinning. As they emerged into the cold morning light of the forest, Elara looked back at the ruins one last time. The place that had been their destination now felt like a distant nightmare. Kaelin's betrayal, the dark magic, the sacrifice, it all seemed unreal, and yet it had happened. "Do you think we'll see him again?" Elara asked quietly as they began their trek back through the forest. "Kaelin?" Rowan's voice was bitter. "If he survived whatever bargain he made, he won't come after us. Not after what we did to the Guardian." Talia nodded in agreement. "He thought he could control the magic of this place. But ancient powers don't bow to anyone." Elara felt a pang of sadness. Kaelin had been a part of their group, and though he had betrayed them, she couldn't help but wonder what had led him down such a dark path. But she knew one thing for certain: whatever had drawn them to these ruins had been dangerous, and they had all been changed by it. As the forest closed in around them, and the ruins disappeared from view, Elara felt a sense of closure. They had faced betrayal, fought against ancient forces, and come out alive. But the journey had taught her something more important than victory over darkness. It had shown her the strength of those who stood beside her. No relic could ever match that. The end.